Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Soldiers of Cinema podcast. I am Colin McFader, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Clark Coffey. How's it going?
It's going really well. How are you doing, Colin?
I'm great.
I know you've been busy.
Yeah. Yes, I have.
And I know you've been busy, and it'll be exciting to talk about that later on, but you've been in pre-production. You're getting ready to begin filming, and that's exciting, so we can talk about that later. But thanks for making some space in your schedule to do this episode.
Talking about Shallow Grave.
Shallow Grave. I was gonna say it, but I was like, no, I don't want to steal your intro. I don't want to steal your intro. I was like, wait, if I just pause, I know Cullen will say it.
Yeah, I got it in there.
That's right.
But Shallow Grave, Danny Boyle's 1994 movie, based all in the Edinburgh, Glasgow area, Scottish film.
That's right.
This is a movie that you chose to do.
I did.
This was your week, and so why don't you kind of describe your I guess, relationship with this movie the first time you saw it? And
yeah, sure. So basically, I did choose the film, and I have to say, shout out to my wife, Amber. She was instrumental in the choosing of this film. I was kind of just talking out loud to myself, and I was thinking, well, what film would I like to do next? What film would I like to do next? And it's tough, right? Because, you don't want to pick something that's like super, super obvious, that's kind of been discussed a million times. But of course, at the same time, generally those films are so fantastic that, I mean, you could talk about them forever. So I certainly wouldn't blame anybody for ever doing that. And obviously, we've discussed films that are widely known and oft discussed. So we've even done that. But I was just trying to think of something like slightly off the beaten path. And, one of the, my favorite eras of film, if you want to call it that, is this time period in the early mid-90s where independent film, especially American, but around the world, I mean, independent film had this huge resurgence. And, this is also a formative period of time in my life. I am in high school. I am, really kind of coming into my own as far as like my awareness of film, and my love of film is like really moving just from kind of like being an audience member to wanting to do this and really, watching film and analyzing it and thinking about it. So, some of my favorite filmmakers come from this era. And so I thought, okay, well, what would be an interesting film so when Amber, my wife, said Shallow Grave, I thought that's an excellent, slightly less obvious example and representation of this time period of film. It's heavily, heavily inspired by, Blood Simple, for example, the Coen brothers' first film. And it not only was the film itself from an artistic perspective inspired by that, but the financing was actually inspired by how the Coens financed Blood Simple. Independent financing, going out and finding dentists, for example, to invest in their film. It was also inspired a lot by Sex, Lies, and Videotape, Soderbergh's film. American independent film really inspired this film. And, at the time in the UK, there wasn't a lot of this type of filmmaking being made. It's also another kind of thing I think that was really happening in the early 90s, in addition to the independent film, was, film that was made for a younger audience, but wasn't made, by older people for a younger audience. It's film being made by young people for a young audience, because before that, sure, there's always been, teen movies and things and coming of age films, but usually it's, at least in the US, it was stuff like Porky's and Animal House. It was kind
Grease.
and it, so it's like people have always been targeting films toward a younger audience, but I mean, I feel like there's a difference here. And I think right off the bat, we'll get into this in a second, the film kicks it off and it just says out loud that this is a film that's made for a younger audience. So I thought that was unique about it, because I think that's another kind of movement, right? There's this hipness to the film. At the time, there wasn't a lot of that being made in the UK. So I think that was important, and I think its influence kind of permeated that, of course, plus 2 years later, Trainspotting. I mean, the two of those films together had, I think, a huge impact on, stylistically, on film around the world.
Yeah,
So that was so that's kind of why I selected the film. Now, as far as my first viewing of it, my goodness, see, this is the thing, we with all these old films from the 90s and things, it's like I can't remember.
Yeah.
I can't remember, except to say that it was absolutely. I mean, I very much remember watching it, and I very much remember the era of this film and its impact to me, with Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, Clerks. I mean, I could go on and I could name a million films, and they're all quite different. Blood Simple, for example, also Sex, Lies, and Videotape. So, there are many, dozens and dozens and dozens of these films, but I really remember it being a part of that. And of course, Danny Boyle has gone on to be an extremely successful director, and of course, Ewan McGregor has gone on to be, one of the most successful actors around. So, I mean, he's even a Jedi, for crying out loud.
He is that, yes.
Who would have
the
thought?
Jedi, Obi-Wan, yeah.
Yeah, who would have thought?
I think what's interesting about what you just said too, about like independent cinema and stuff, is we did, I think, have a similar conversation in an earlier episode about kind of the like liberalization or liberation, sorry, not liberalization, liberation of like of filmmaking in the 90s, because that was kind of when a lot of formats like 16 millimeter were coming into play.
Right.
And then of course in the late 90s you had really early digital like video.
Sex, Lies, and Videotape, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think it's this movie, I don't think it's a coincidence that something like this kind of exists within that era. However, what I will say is that it's super different than like the American independent movie, like stylistically, a lot of films, of course, were kind of inspired, even at the time, by like Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez and stuff like that, and Kevin Smith. Whereas this film really definitely, and perhaps being an ocean away is the reason, but also perhaps because Boyle had a very, unique vision for the way that he wanted to make this movie, that it's very much stylistically its own thing. That there's similar DNA, but yeah, it's really interesting to see how unique this is and how unlike a lot of other, not only American but also other British independent film. And another important thing to kind of discuss contextually about this movie as well is that it kind of came in an era where there wasn't really a lot of influential British film being made. That, like, if you think of the late 80s, early 90s in British film, it's like, okay, what is there? There is, like, the James Bond movies, which are, of course, the two main producers on those are Americans.
Right.
And it's like MGM. And while those are very much, I think,
I feel like by the end of the
identity.
70s, I just consider them American films, basically.
Exactly,
right?
exactly. And it was like Dalton and Pierce Brosnan.
You're right.
But other than that, like, you can't, of course, I'm not saying that I can't think of any British films from, late 80s, early 90s, but can you really think of like a British film from that era that was like really influential or kind of like a showstopper in terms of like redefined itself? And I think that this movie in particular is super influential because of the fact that you look at, and I'm not sure how much British film that you've watched, Clark, but we of course get a lot of it here in Canada.
Right.
British film and British television.
Yes. And that's an interesting distinction because of course we do a little bit more now, but I think especially then we weren't exposed to a lot. I mean, of course, if you were to try to watch the BBC, for example, here in the United States in the 90s, good luck. I don't even know if there was a way to. Now, of course, now
you can get the cable packages.
You can get the cable package, or you could just stream it or whatever. And so there's certainly a greater exposure. But that's a good point. So
but I think that the really ultimate kind of idea behind that as well is that you watch British television, especially from the late 90s, early 2000s, and you can see how much this movie, and I think Trainspotting as well, would have influenced that style. Like, the style is down to the quick, like the opening scene of this movie is so pulled from for like 1,000 pilots of British television, from comedy to drama. Peep Show is one of my favorite TV shows of all time. It was David Mitchell and Robert Webb, and it was kind of early 2000s, and I think they stopped it in like 2012. But the primary influence, I would say, was like that really early 2000s. Even that film, there's like a lot of like stylistic stuff that kind of is I don't know if it's intentionally taken or perhaps it was just the cultural zeitgeist that kind of was made up from this and Trainspotting, but I do think it's really interesting to see those stylistic choices, the like really really British techno music that is used in the opening, and it's just this, if you want to understand what British life was like in the mid 90s, you can really watch this movie and see that, like, the clothes that they wear, the music that they listen to, the quick editing, it's all is so just super influential, I think, over British culture. And you think of other British films,
dialogue, and
exactly, and like Shaun of the Dead that came out in, I think, 2005, so a decade after this. I would even say that, Edgar Wright likely very inspired by a movie like this, because Shaun of the Dead, although it's a completely different movie and much more of a comedy than this is a, very black comedy, but Shaun of the Dead, much more an overt comedy. I think Edgar Wright's editing style and stuff like that really likely was inspired by a movie like this. So I do think it's interesting that for a movie that, I don't think a lot of people really talk about, far more people talk about Trainspotting than this. Because of course it was a larger movie, but you can really see those seeds kind of start to be planted in this that would then, I think, morph into what Trainspotting became. And it's the same director, same writer, same cinematographer, so
same
not
lead.
Surprised. It's the same lead, Ewan McGregor, so not a surprise that the movies are similar and that their impact was kind of, still, I think, to me, everlasting.
How wonderful is that, by the way, just to kind of point out? I mean, how lucky, I don't know, it's not luck, of course. They worked hard, and I'm sure there was like a long and kind of thorough, kind of organic kind of coming together of these people. But how wonderful that you've got so many people who wanted to work on this, further films together. I mean, I think the chunk of this team also worked on A Life Less Ordinary. And I mean, so really, obviously, like, they enjoyed working with each other. They clicked. They're making great films. I personally think A Life Less Ordinary, 1997, is a much underrated film. I actually think it's quite fun, but it's kind of fallen through the cracks and is kind of lost nowadays. But regardless, I mean, gosh, that's like, I feel like that's what I would, love to be able to find. I mean, I'm a little bit jealous. I'm like, it's such a joy to find, when you find a core group of people, you work well together, you make good films together. That's hard to find. So anyway, that always kind of stands out to me when I see that you've got a core group of people who continue to work together over and over and over. And I do feel like, just to kind of digress for a second, I think that Ewan and am I making something up? Did Ewan and Danny kind of have a bit of a falling out at some point? I'm not quite sure.
I'm not sure. I know they returned to each other for T2.
They returned for T2, but I feel like there might have been just a hair of some kind of little bit of falling out there. But regardless, anyway, so that always stands out.
Perhaps,
to me. That always stands out to me because I'm looking for that myself. But come back to it. But
and so I think to me also, I'm, to get perhaps more into like my reaction of the film and like what I thought about it. So I'm somebody, just to preface, I don't really think, especially when it comes to art, that there's any such thing as like objectivity. Okay. So I always watch movies with that lens, and that's kind of how I'm watching them. So even if I don't necessarily gel with a film, or I don't necessarily like agree with choices, if that makes any sense.
Sure. And we've talked about that in the past.
I still always, appreciate or try to appreciate and try to get in the headspace of like the choices that are being made and the intentions that are being made.
Totally.
And so, and I definitely found myself enjoying the movie. There were certain things that I think were definitely interesting and I think that could have been, or had they been maybe fleshed out a little bit more, I think I personally would have likely enjoyed it more. And one of those aspects is definitely the kind of, I guess, the way that the plot is structured. It seems to focus very heavily on certain things and then almost skip over other things that I think, and perhaps, again, I haven't read the screenplay for this movie. I'm not sure how similar it was, or if how much had to change because they shot it in 30 days and
right.
So I'm not sure if there was like changes, but one of the things that really jumped out at me watching this is, of course, the character David, who is played by Christopher Eccleston. He goes he's kind of starts out as like the main character, not the main character, sorry, but the character who is like put together. He seems like the normal, most put together. Yeah, he's like kind of like, I don't think we should do this, and then as they start like spoiler alert, as they discover the dead body and decide to bury the dead body and steal the money. He's kind of the one that's really hesitant, but he has to cut up the body, and sort of that drives him insane.
They draw straws, and they kind of build that
up. He gets the short straw.
He's the one that's like, I'm not going to be able to do this. I won't be able to do this. I can't do this. And then of course, he's the one that draws the short straw. So he's got to, just to be clear, he's dismembering the body of a flatmate, a brand new flatmate
who they hardly even know.
They hardly even know. They were interviewing flatmates, which I think is a really fun. Just 2 seconds, just to interject this.
Totally.
A super fun way and a very effective way to introduce the characters and for us to kind of develop an understanding. They've got these flatmates who are interviewing a potential fourth additional new flatmate, and it's just so fun to see these characters interacting and how they're kind of, really terrorizing, quite frankly, just being like horrifically rude and mean to these potential new flatmates. And this is the guy that they settle on, and he moves in like his first night, and he ODs and dies on the bed.
Well, also, I think that just to point out some things about that opening scene, it really does a really wonderful job, I think, of establishing tone.
Yes.
And that you kind of realize that this movie's not necessarily, like, it's not really going for, like, realism. It's definitely a heightened sense of...
It's theatrical. It's
definitely very theatrical. And it sort of feels almost shot like theater, and because the set is huge. It almost feels like a theater set. Even just like the what's her name? What's the...
Kerry Fox. Kerry Fox,
So she like just comes out topless in front of her. Like they've got this like weirdly casual, like almost like they're a throuple, like weirdly enough, like that they've got this like,
and that's part of it. You definitely get, there's certain moments where you do have this kind of sexual tension that kind of exists between the three of them. It's not even remotely something that is. I don't think they don't go there. It's not like one of those films about like a love triangle at all, but it certainly does play into, it's almost kind of a Mexican standoff-ish kind of thing at the end, as far as who's taking the money and this kind of thing. But yeah, I think it works.
But to get back so essentially, they've got this dead body they've got to dispose of, and the one who is the most hesitant about doing it, and the most sure that he won't be able to do it, is of course, the one that has to do it.
And that has to do it, of course, right.
And so then that kind of, drives him insane. He starts living in the attic with the money and is going like drilling holes in the ceiling so he can
look down,
see these things. And so what I realized, or what I noticed, or what kind of really stood out to me while I was watching it, was just that I felt it was a little bit unearned. I felt that he just kind of went from being this timid kind of like nervous guy to suddenly like there wasn't really, I sort of mentioned this in our pre-conversation, Clark, but where I find that a lot of times the things that kind of work, like it's kind of like if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I think that in these types of situations where you have a character going insane, you can kind of do, and this isn't at all to say that there are only two options to do these things. Of course, other people have done very wonderful ways of going outside the box with this. But the two most common are either that you have a character go slowly insane and you keep kind of, bringing in the subtleties and have these like moments where they're just sort of like, oh, they start to go insane and will they, won't they, and whatnot. That, or you can have a moment where like it's like a snap, like they've just suddenly been like, okay, I'm insane now and I'm crazy. And again, not to say that those are the only two options, and movies have done plenty of other things.
Right.
I found that this movie almost did neither and didn't really go even a third way, that it just kind of felt like I think it was the one point of this movie where I almost felt the screenplay was on the wall, where I was like, okay, he's going crazy now because he has to, and that's because the screenplay's calling for it, and so he's got to go up and live in the attic because that's what's written. And I didn't really feel like, I never really felt like every time he went up to the attic, I was just kind of like, is he is this a bit, or is he actually insane now, or what? And so I just thought that like, I almost feel like it needed more directional clarity. Okay. That it needed to really like, and again, it wasn't that it was hard to understand. I'm not saying that it like needed to be spelled out, but rather I think that like a moment like that is really ripe for tension and it's really ripe for storytelling. Yeah. And I almost felt like it was sort of like a missed opportunity, like that they could have played with that a lot more and made it kind of a lot of fun to have this character going insane, but rather he just kind of does it and goes off and lives in the attic. Right. And it's like
I think that's a fair point. I think it's a completely fair point. And I in hindsight, now I have to say it didn't jump out to me in the same way that it stood out to you. I think I did kind of notice something, But, my interpretation of it was a little bit different. I think, most films that have this kind of plot structure and are kind of in this thematic space, they tend to often focus on that. That's kind of a focal point for the story, is that you're going to have a character going through this, and now we're going to kind of make this about their grip on reality or grip on sanity slip, or it's going to be about how guilt or their conscience eats them from the inside. And, I think that's a very common theme. And so, I think we're often expecting that to be something that a film will focus on. And, I just don't think this film wanted to be that. I just don't think that they wanted to go down that route.
And I totally agree. Yeah, I think that it was not the intention, or that rather it was the intention totally to not go down that route.
Yeah. So in other words, I don't think it was like we meant to do this, but we failed to communicate it in our script or the execution of the script. Rather, I just think it was a choice that this film is about something else. And, maybe it's about, the indifference of our current culture, or it's about materialism, or it's about, any number of other things potentially. And maybe that's even part of the point, was that, they don't go into great detail about this person kind of losing their sanity, because maybe there's not much sanity to have been lost in the first place, even though, I think, these characters, when we first see them, they have what by any appearances would be a very expensive apartment in a city, any city. It's huge, right?
Especially
huge.
Today.
and it looks quite nice. And I never lived in an apartment that nice in a city ever in my life.
Or that big. Their kitchen is like the size of most regular apartments.
Seriously, they've got like, an 800 square foot kitchen, for crying out loud. And, one of them is a doctor. The other works at an accounting firm, or was it law firm? I can't
He's
remember.
A chartered accountant, yeah.
Okay, yep, that's what I thought. So he's an accountant, and then you have our third character, Ewan, is a journalist. And at that time, newspapers still existed, and you might even have made a decent salary if you were a journalist for a newspaper. So unlike when I worked for a newspaper in 2000, but back then you actually probably could have made a decent living. So, and they're well put together. They're well dressed. They're hip. They're sharp, and they're making fun of everybody.
They
all the
seem
time.
to get along.
They're kind of in their little bubble of coolness, right? And so maybe that's the point, is that with all these things, at the end of the day, there's maybe not a whole lot there inside. And the set kind of alludes to this, right? You could make an argument that this huge, wide open space that is on its surface quite bright and cheery is actually quite empty inside. And of course, we're introduced to these characters. They're ridiculing people they don't even know. They're inviting people over to the house to look at the flat, and they're like grilling them in this grueling and embarrassing, series of questions, and they're taunting them.
Just as an aside too, it's actually interesting that one of the characters that they interview comes back later on in the movie when they're at like that little like almost dinner thing.
Right.
And I honestly, because he came back, I expected him to come back a third time and like have a something to do with the end of the movie, but he
something
of course,
more, yeah.
Just a little aside, but because there's just that one character that he really does seem to torment.
Yeah, where they're doing that. Is it? Boy, I'm gonna mess this.
It's the dinner for the.
It's the Seeley dancing. Is that how you pronounce it? It's the Scottish Seeley dancing.
Yeah.
They're at that formal kind of black tie and kilt party, right?
Yeah.
Right. So but regardless, not trying to talk you out of your opinion on that. But this is the great thing about this stuff. You could see it, several different ways for sure. And
I totally, and that's one of those things that, again, when I say like, I think that everything is ultimately, subjective. I don't see that as Danny Boyle just failing to represent insanity. I think that it was very much the intention of the film, like you said, to not focus on that. I just, to me, think that I felt like it would have perhaps added to the movie had it been included.
Fair.
Maybe not, though. We don't know because it's it's not in the movie, so there's nothing
Right.
that we can do to, imagine. All we
We'll
can
have
do
to
is
hop
imagine
over.
if it was
We'll
in
have
there.
to hop over to a parallel universe and see what,
Yeah, where that was.
you know,
Yeah.
we
And
maybe
speaking of,
you and I in a parallel universe are doing this podcast right now, and we're actually
Yeah.
talking about a different movie that Danny Boyle made called Shallow Grave, where they focused on.
and we're like, I don't like that at all. No, I do think that to go off
And you're
about,
complaining about that direction.
yeah,
and
exactly. No matter what, that's a lesson for any filmmaker out there. No matter what, I will complain about your movie.
You know, one of the other things I kind of quick, because we're touched on a lot of different things here.
Yeah.
I briefly kind of mentioned the set, but I want to talk. Another thing that when you asked me what my mindset was when I picked the film, the other thing that I think is really important, and maybe for listeners specifically to our podcast, and I think certainly for you and I, is that this film was made for such little money, and I think it's a really good example of a film that is made on purpose with a budget in mind. We've got almost no money. What can we do? And so, I think this is a good example of minimal location, and simple story. And so that was the other reason. And
very low budget. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting how some of the choices that you kind of are forced to make can actually end up being being great decisions. It's like the set.
It's the constraints that bring you out.
Constraints, right?
Yeah.
Like the set I was talking about. I mean, it's this huge set, and it is a set. It wasn't a real flat, but it was actually a set. And Danny had wanted the set to be built quite large, and I'm only kind of guessing. That maybe he wanted it large because he wanted to have space for the crew. He wanted to be able to put the camera in as many places as possible.
Yeah.
And without, I guess, and they didn't want to make flyaway walls or something. And he probably didn't want it to feel, insanely claustrophobic. If you ever try to shoot something interior in like an actual house, unless you've got just a giant mammoth house, it looks tiny. I mean, it really makes a film feel claustrophobic. And so I think we're shooting in one location, so he wanted to have at least some kind of scope, but they didn't have any money to actually fill it with much. So
Yes.
it's a pretty empty apartment, and so you could think, well, wow, crap, what if we've got this like nice big space and we don't have any furniture, we don't have anything in it, oh my gosh! But I feel like it works so well. As a symbolic representation of the state of these characters.
Like they've got fulfilling lives, quote unquote,
but are empty.
But it's just they're empty, yeah. And I think that to me is kind of the ultimate. At least the theme that I took away from it is this day-to-day monotony, this emptiness of like your life, even if you have a good paying job and a nice apartment and good friends, that there's like this emptiness to just like living life in that way. And that's kind of, again, this is my interpretation, why Ewan McGregor's character jumps on the chance to like do something exciting, do something different, do something kind of insane and illegal, and for a thrill, exactly.
For a thrill, and look where it gets them. So,
yes,
and that leads us into something that I want to, we can use this film as kind of an example of that I think might be interesting to explore with you. Is in watching the film again, and I always like to read a few of the at that time contemporary reviews and kind of see what were critics thinking about a film when it was actually released, so that it's in the context of the world in which it was released. I always like doing that, and one of the critiques that I came across by a handful of critics actually was that they felt like so yes, this is a film of style, and it especially for its budget, very competently made. And many people even said, and I thought it was interesting and I enjoyed watching it, but there were a lot of people who said, but what the hell is the film saying? Like what is the film for? Why we've got all of this story, but what is it leading up to? We've got these young people dismembering bodies and what for stolen drug money, and what is it like? What they were? I guess they were. It felt to me like they were expecting that Danny Boyle have some kind of make some kind of moral statement, or have some kind of
or some big lesson or theme,
and that really stood out to me, because I have often kind of thought about this idea that film has to have some kind of didactic stance.
Yes.
Or sometimes even, frankly, kind of, propaganda ish stance versus just
Like it
being
has
there
to be telling you something.
for
Yeah.
the right versus just being there for its own aesthetic, like just to exist aesthetically. And
Yeah.
and I felt like this is a good example of a film that kind of brings up that question. And so I'd be interested to discuss that with you. You know,
Yeah, I mean, I think that people often have these like check boxes in their mind when they watch a movie that goes like they don't really think about why they have them. So it's like, okay, it's got a clear theme, it's got a clear message, it's got, you know, a 3-act structure, it's got you know, blah blah blah. There's, you know, however
Right.
long it goes. Like I remember when the 8th Star Wars movie, I think it was the 8th, The Last
eighth.
Jedi came out, and there was a whole bunch of, you know, this is totally, you know, a different context and very
Right.
different movie, but I remember when that came out, there were a bunch of people that were like, well, you know, I didn't like it because there was no lightsaber fight, and I didn't like it because there was no, like, they didn't use the one line that's in every other Star Wars movie, and I was like, yeah, but was the movie good?
Right.
It's like who cares if it doesn't check off the boxes that
Right.
are unrelated? And so to me, that's one of those things that, and I've had this experience plenty, and I'm sure you have as well, in writing movies, especially group writing, or if you're writing and getting feedback from other people. And one of my least favorite questions is like, well, like, what's the theme? You know, like, what is it about? What is it saying? And it's like, you know, even if I were to answer that question, even if I were to say, and there of course are times when you do have subtext in mind, and I'm sure that Danny Boyle, in making this movie, and John Hodges writing this movie had these things perhaps in mind. Perhaps they did, but I'm, you know,
Well,
I wouldn't be surprised if they did.
I think it's inevitable. There's a difference between subconscious and conscious. There's a difference.
Yes.
I mean, I think that there's no way that you can't tell a story without some kind of theme, but I think that themes, because I don't know, you know, this
you try to,
really
people try to force
esoteric,
it,
but,
right?
But themes exist in everything because we are interpretive beings. We are
Well, and that's what I mean ultimately, right? Is
You know-
that no matter what your theme is that you decide on in production or even writing, I guarantee that 99% of the audience will come away with a different message or
with
a
their
different
own,
interpretation. And so
Right.
like even my interpretation about this just monotony of life and stuff, like perhaps that wasn't what they were going for at all, but that's what I came out of it with, and that doesn't make me wrong. It doesn't make me any less like, you know,
course not.
bring any less enjoyment to the movie. So
Right.
I do think it's interesting though that people really, and especially I think people who either want to be screenwriters and oftentimes screenwriters themselves, that they put these like checklists of you know what's good, whereas I think what's important is what you feel while you're watching a movie. Is, you know, a good movie to me is something that you go away from talking about because of the feelings that you had, not necessarily because of like subtext and things like that. And there always, you know, going to be that implied subtext, but
I think,
but yeah.
you know, to kind of, you know, and I want to clarify too for people listening, you know, what I absolutely think that a filmmaker should have an opinion, have a perspective,
and a point of view,
have a point of view, and that those that a writer should, that a director should. I mean, ideally, every single person involved in the project has a perspective and a point of view. So that's not at all what I'm talking about. I'm talking about rather that, you know, I think there's, you know, it's okay for a film to exist without having to, you know, kind of, without it being intended to teach, right? Having some kind of moral instruction or ulterior motive behind the story, you know, or that's kind of the thing that I'm talking about.
I think that the classic example is like I've met a lot of people who see Jaws as like an allegory for Brody's drinking problem, like Chief Brody's, because he's always drinking in the movie, and that it's like this, and so that's what I mean. Is it's like if you watch the movie,
it's a drunken
and you take
hallucination.
That away,
He's
yes,
not
exactly.
even really.
Yeah, the shark is the bottle. But if you take that away from the movie, totally fine. That's cool. But I don't think that Jaws is any less.
Yeah.
Without that interpretation, right? Like I don't think that Spielberg, when making it, was like making active choices to. Yeah.
I mean, thank goodness Spielberg didn't, and that's okay. Like that's great, right? Because Jaws can represent any kind of like unknown threat, right? Anything that's a threat to humanity. But the point is, though, is that Spielberg, I don't think, if my recollection of the film, made a bunch of like overt, explicit commentaries on how a person should handle that threat, or, you know, he wasn't making moral valuations left and right. where a lot of films do. Now, again, like, and I'm not saying that people should make those films if they want to. Make all kinds of film. It was just specifically kind of saying, addressing the issue that some people think that art has to exist beyond just the aesthetic.
That it's required, yeah.
Or even like, I mean, one of the things that I think is so interesting to me is that, I mean, obviously we are storytelling machines. Human beings are storytelling machines, and every single person on the face of this planet, if they are conscious, can tell a story and understand story. Story is just another word for how people process the world that they live in. We create narratives because that's how our brain works for understanding our lives. That's it, right?
Yeah.
We think about our past, we experience our future, and we worry about we experience our present and we worry about our future. We have a first, second, third act. It's like, things have a beginning, middle, end. We're always putting our life experiences and our memories in narratives so that we can try to understand causal relationships. If I do this, what will happen? If this happens, what will I do? We're constantly doing that. And so there's no way, none of us can tell a story that doesn't contain important themes about what it means to be human. But I guess the point is to let those happen kind of organically as you are telling a story for the sake of telling a story, as opposed to being overly, explicitly, conscientiously trying to force ideology or moral themes, and it's okay.
And again, especially thinking that's necessary, like feeling bad on yourself or feeling down for not having those things.
It's okay if you want to do that, but it's
again,
also
another
okay
way
if
to
you
put
don't.
it too is just that like people always talk about this idea that it's like the critique of a movie is like, it was all style and no substance.
Right.
To me, they're the same thing. Style is substance. There can be a film that is visually beautiful. That I think that filmmaking, not even going beyond the idea that film is a visual medium, going beyond that every single shot in a movie, period, is infused with a director's point of view, is infused with the cinematographer's point of view and the actor's performance. And you could be watching the most simple story be told in 5 minutes on film, and there would still be such a point of view infused with those things just by the nature of how movies are made. And so I think that is a really important way to watch movies, and that I think that it, again, very much something that's related to this movie, because as you mentioned, a lot of people were sort of saying like, what is that about? What is this movie trying to say? And it's sometimes that's not necessarily important or the point. It's not necessarily something that has to be talked about.
Exactly. And I think there's an interesting irony here, frankly, and like, especially as it relates to like what we're trying to do right now. I think there's an interesting irony in that, like what we're doing on this podcast, right? We are trying our best, sometimes with great success, sometimes maybe with less success, but we're trying our best to articulate our experience of films, right? That's what we're here doing. And we're doing this by talking about how it looks and how it sounds and how the actors performed and, the context of the film and all these other different ways that we can kind of experience it. But we're trying to take our experience, our feelings of it, and put it into words for people to share with them, and hopefully improve upon their experience of the film, or talk them into seeing the film, or, who knows. But I think it's interesting. I feel almost like, this is me kind of riffing here, that, the more a film is kind of approaches this unapproachable, perfect cinema, which is like this, completely visual experience, this kind of, totally enveloping aesthetic experience. The more a film approaches kind of a pure art, it becomes harder and harder to articulate, because it's more and more subconsciously affecting, because I feel like that's the point of art to great extent. And that's what aesthetic awe is. When you see something that's so beautiful that it just goes right past your conscious brain, and it's something you feel it in your body. It's a physical, experiential thing. And then if you're asked to dissect that, it's challenging. And the more a piece of art it inspires an aesthetic awe, the harder it is to kind of talk about. So
I think it's also one of the reasons that one of the more interesting things to do is to go back and rewatch a movie that you disliked, that you saw a long time ago, and find that you love it now.
Oh, that's
there are a
happened to
lot
me
of
so
movies
many
like
times.
that. Yeah,
Oh,
where
gosh,
it's like
Blade Runner was a movie like that. The first time I watched Blade Runner, I thought it was trash. Now, admittedly, I saw it with the Harrison Ford voiceover, but first time I saw Blade Runner, I thought it was trash. I thought, this is such a cold piece of art, or cold piece of film, sorry. I didn't even think it was art. I was like, this is such a cold piece of film. It's so emotionless. It looks pretty, sure, but I've nothing from this. I'm getting nothing from this. And then I've seen it, I don't even know how many times since, and it's one of my favorite films of all time.
It's like me, and we all know how, if you've been listening to this podcast, how I feel about Malick. I'm a big Malick fan.
Yeah.
But when I first saw Malick, when I was like much younger, I was probably like late middle school when I kind of first, I don't remember which one I saw of his first, but I just remember being like, oh, it's so pretentious. It's just like, you might as well just film like an apple falling from a tree, and like that's the whole movie, and you're not saying anything. You're just trying to be weird and out there and flowery. And then as I got older, I started rewatching all these movies of Malick's, and I was like, geez, like I like, it really penetrated me in a way that I was like, this, like the underlying, even not even to go with underlying message, but rather the underlying tone of these
you opened
films.
yourself up to it, and that just illustrates too how art is not just about the creator. It is at least equally as much about the person who's observing or experiencing that art. And
so perhaps in 10 years I'll rewatch this movie, and I will. And this isn't a movie that I disliked by any means, but perhaps I will get way more out of this film.
It'll be a different experience
the next time I watch. Then
right.
So
You'll be
interesting
a different
to kind
person. And that's what's always so intriguing to me. So point just being, we can kind of wrap up here pretty soon. But the point just being that I think this was an interesting example. I think a piece of a film can exist to tell a story that doesn't have to have this really kind of conscientiously planned, value statement,
this master plan
attached to it, and I'm okay with that. And I'm curious too. I do want to ask one last question here because this is, in talking about all of this, is kind of I'm curious to compare notes on this, on your viewing experience in general, not just this film, but in any. One of the things that I find happening to me is that I focus quite a bit more on the visual storytelling, the visual aspect of the storytelling in a film than I do sometimes dialogue, but especially plot. And it's so funny that I will be so focused on watching a film, and I kind of sometimes can get lost as to what's going on in the plot in a literal sense, because I'm like so focused on kind of trying to absorb all of these visual aspects of the film. I'm curious, what do you find you tend to kind of focus on?
No, I'm totally the same.
Are you?
Plot is the
last thing.
Even if it's a matter of like I fully understand it, I usually will be the last thing I even comment on in terms of rather the least important thing of whether I liked it or not. A movie can have a plot that I don't care about at all, and so that's why I think it's important to like when we discussed At Close Range. Which is a movie that, again, I was sort of talking about when we were talking about it, how I was like, well, this thing kind of fell a little bit flat for me plot-wise, but the reason that I still enjoyed that movie so much was because the movie had a really rich visual language.
Right.
And so even though there were things that I could critique about the plot or critique about the way that the story was told, to me that's second to... Well, what did I feel? How did the visuals make me feel? And it's not to say that it's purely visual as in just like, oh, is the framing good? I think... it's much more. It's rich. It's about film being a visual story. Do the visuals ooze with what the director is trying to say and the point of view and the choices being made?
Absolutely. That's interesting, and it's funny, of course, and this plays out in our podcast because it's almost never that we discuss any plot-based aspects.
No, we don't just go
films.
through.
I mean, I feel like, hey, if you want to know the plot, see it. But I think a lot of people who are really focused on plot, and you talked about people who have like kind of a checklist of things that they have to kind of see in a film. I mean, plot is clearly very important to people, and I think again, not to digress too much, but plot. The importance of plot seems to be ever increasing as television, and I'm going to call streaming now television. We watch it on their television, and it's really no different materially than what television was in the past.
In the way it's
there's
made,
no commercials, but But television is very much about plot. It's writer's medium. It's dialogue driven, but plot is important because when people want to make 9 seasons of a TV show, you've got to have a lot of stuff going on for a long period of time.
You got to know where to go.
So often you'll have, just plot after, you've got an A, B, C, D story. You've got just plot out the yin yang, and this is kind of why I much prefer film, is that generally speaking, yes, there are things actually literally happening, but it's much less about plot. And often my favorite films have very little plot, period. And it's not about what's happening. So sometimes I think the same people who get hung up on what's the theme and what is the director trying to say morally about something are often also plot is very important to them.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And to each their own too, by the way, I want to say.
Yeah, I don't think either of us are saying that watching the movie in that way is wrong. Or that like there's a wrong way to interpret things or wrong thing to get out of movies, but rather that I think both of me and you agree on that when it comes to us, and perhaps that's been made very clear through the way that we've discussed these movies over the past little while. Yeah, it's just that we just tend to, I for sure tend to gravitate more towards, the to use a very contemporary term, the vibes, the what was I feeling and what was I experiencing while I was watching, as opposed to going like, well, what was that exactly about?
Yeah, absolutely. Well,
but
yeah. Well, excellent. Well, I will wrap it up here now. Thanks for being willing to watch Shallow Grave. I enjoyed our conversation about it, and it's interesting how some of these films can kind of bring up, larger kind of more broad questions about art and film, which is always enjoyable, and I could discuss these kind of things forever. But we won't take forever here. But all right, well, hey, break a leg on your shooting. We will.
Thank you.
We're going to definitely delve into some of that in another episode, I think, or even maybe several episodes. So look forward to that, everybody. But break a leg shooting, and everybody out there listening, we will catch you in the next episode.
See ya.